February 25th, 1956. East Berlin, Soviet sector. Soviet military engineers were conducting a routine inspection of underground cables near the Schönefelder Chaussee. They were looking for a fault in their communications lines. Instead, they found something impossible. A tunnel. A sophisticated, professionally constructed tunnel running from West Berlin deep into East Berlin, equipped with air conditioning, lighting, and electronic equipment, tapping directly into the main Soviet military communication cables. The tunnel was 1,476 feet long, nearly 5 football fields. It was 6 feet in diameter. It had been operating undetected for 11 months, intercepting every phone call and every telegram, every communication between Soviet military headquarters in East Germany and Moscow. The Soviets were stunned. The engineering required was extraordinary. The security needed to keep it secret was unprecedented. The intelligence gathered was incalculable. They called it the intelligence coup of the century. Western newspapers have called it Operation Gold or the Berlin Tunnel. The Soviets called it proof of American technical superiority and audacious spycraft. What the Soviets didn't know, what nobody knew for decades, was that the operation had been compromised from the very beginning. A Soviet mole inside British intelligence had betrayed the tunnel before the first shovel of dirt was moved. The Soviets knew about the tunnel the entire time. They let it operate. They carefully managed what information flowed through the tapped lines, and they pretended to be shocked when they discovered it. This is the complete story of the Berlin Tunnel, the most ambitious intelligence operation of the Cold War. The engineering marvel that shouldn't have been possible. The espionage triumph that was actually a counterintelligence masterpiece. And the operation where both sides claimed victory and both were right. To understand why the Berlin Tunnel was so audacious, you need to understand Berlin in the early 1950s. And the answer is, it was a city divided, surrounded, and saturated with spies. After World War II, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin, located deep inside the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 sectors. By 1949, the Western zones had merged to form West Germany, Federal Republic of Germany, and the Soviet zone became East Germany, German Democratic Republic. Berlin remained divided. West Berlin was an island of Western control surrounded by Soviet-controlled East Germany. The border between East and West Berlin in the early 1950s was not yet the Berlin Wall that wouldn't be built until 1961. Instead, it was a lightly guarded boundary that Berliners could cross relatively easily. Thousands of people crossed daily for work, shopping, or visiting family. This made Berlin the espionage capital of the world. Spies from both sides operated openly. Intelligence agencies recruited agents, ran operations, and gathered information. Everyone knew everyone else was spying, but there was an unspoken understanding that Berlin was where the intelligence war was fought. The Soviets had a major problem. Their military headquarters for East Germany was in Karlshorst, a suburb in the Soviet sector of Berlin. All their military communications phone calls to Moscow, orders to units across East Germany, logistics reports, intelligence summaries ran through telephone cables buried under East Berlin. These cables were an intelligence goldmine. If the West could tap those cables, they could read Soviet military communications in real time. Plans, deployments, capabilities, and intentions, everything. But the cables were in the Soviet sector, deep underground, heavily guarded. Accessing them seemed impossible. The CIA and British SIS, Secret Intelligence Service, also known as MI6, had been studying the problem since 1951. They had detailed maps of the cable routes. They knew exactly where the main trunk lines were. They knew how much intelligence those cables carried. But they couldn't figure out how to access them. The cables were buried under Soviet-controlled territory. Any attempt to dig them up would be detected immediately. Guards patrolled the area. Soviet counterintelligence was always watching. And some accounts differ on exactly who first proposed it suggested the impossible. Build a tunnel from West Berlin into East Berlin, running under the border and tap the cables underground. The proposal seemed crazy. The tunnel would need to be nearly 1,500 feet long. It would need to be dug in absolute secrecy if the Soviets discovered construction. They'd know exactly what the West was attempting. It would need sophisticated equipment to tap the cables without being detected. and it would need to operate undetected for months or years. But the potential intelligence was so valuable that CIA and SIS decided to try. The operation was codenamed Operation Gold by the Americans and Operation Stopwatch by the British. Planning began in late 1953. The first challenge was location. The tunnel needed to start in West Berlin and end where the Soviet cables were buried in East Berlin. But it needed to start somewhere that wouldn't attract attention. They selected a site in the Rudow district of West Berlin, very close to the border. The CIA would build a fake radar station and warehouse complex as cover. The building would be used for processing radar intelligence, a plausible cover story that would explain the security, the vehicles coming and going, and the construction. The real purpose was to provide cover for tunnel construction and operation. The site was carefully chosen. It was close enough to the border that the tunnel could reach the target cables. It had good drainage, crucial for a tunnel that would be 20 feet underground. And it was in an area where new construction wouldn't seem suspicious. Construction of the warehouse and radar station began in September 1954. This was the overt cover. While that was being built, planning for the tunnel itself intensified. The engineering challenges were formidable. The tunnel needed to be 1,476 feet long. It needed to be about 6 feet in diameter to allow workers to move through it and install equipment. It needed to slope slightly downward from West Berlin to East Berlin to allow drainage water seeping into the tunnel needed to flow back toward the west, where it could be pumped out. The tunnel needed to be deep enough that Soviet seismic detectors wouldn't pick up vibrations from digging. About 20 feet underground was calculated as safe depth. But here's the critical challenge. The tunnel would cross under the border into Soviet-controlled territory. If the Soviets detected any unusual seismic activity or ground disturbance on their side, they'd investigate. The entire tunnel would need to be dug so carefully that no vibrations, no ground settling, no unusual activity would be detectable from above. This meant slow, methodical excavation using techniques normally reserved for mining under sensitive structures. And it meant absolute silence, no pile drivers, no explosives, no heavy machinery that might be heard or felt above ground. The British SIS took the lead on the actual tunnel engineering because they had more experience with tunneling operations from Walla II operations. The Americans provided funding, equipment, and much of the electronic surveillance equipment. Excavation began in February 1955. The actual digging started from a shaft beneath the warehouse building. Workers could access the shaft from inside the warehouse, completely hidden from any observation. The tunnel was dug using hand tools and small mechanical excavators. Every bucket of dirt had to be hauled back through the tunnel, brought up the shaft, and disposed of secretly. Thousands of tons of dirt, all removed without anyone noticing. The dirt couldn't just be piled up that would attract attention. It had to be trucked away, disguised as normal construction debris or hidden within the warehouse complex. The tunnel advanced about 20 feet per day. That's agonizingly slow, but it was the maximum speed that wouldn't create detectable vibrations. The tunnel was lined with steel rings as it was dug. Each ring was about 3 feet wide and had to be carefully installed to prevent collapse. The rings were standard sewer tunnel equipment, procured through normal construction supply channels, so as not to attract attention. As the tunnel advanced, electrical cables were strung along it for lighting and power. Ventilation ducts were installed to bring fresh air to the tunnel face where workers were digging. Communication lines were run so workers at the tunnel face could coordinate with the command post in the warehouse. The tunnel needed climate control. The equipment that would eventually tap the cables generated heat. The tunnel would be full of electronic equipment. Without climate control, it would become unbearably hot and humid. So a sophisticated air conditioning system was installed in industrial units hidden in the warehouse, with ducts running the entire length of the tunnel. This was 1955 technology, so the system was large and noisy by modern standards. But it worked. After 6 months of digging, the tunnel reached the target location directly under the Soviet cables. Now came the most delicate part, breaking through to the cable chamber and installing the taps without the Soviets detecting any interruption in service. The Soviet cables ran through an underground chamber, a concrete vault about 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall. The chamber was accessible from the surface through manholes, but those were locked and periodically inspected by Soviet security. The tunnel needed to penetrate the chamber floor from below, install taps on the cables, and seal everything so it looked normal if Soviet technicians entered the chamber. This was done over several days in August 1955. Workers carefully excavated upward from the tunnel until they broke through the concrete floor of the cable chamber. The breakthrough was done at night to minimize the chance of detection. Once through, they installed taps on 3 major cable bundles. Each bundle contained hundreds of individual communication lines. The taps were sophisticated devices that could pick up the electrical signals on the cables without degrading the signal quality. If the signal quality dropped, Soviet technicians would investigate. The tap equipment was connected to amplifiers and recording devices back in the tunnel. Miles of cable ran back through the tunnel to the warehouse where banks of tape recorders were installed to capture everything. The breakthrough point in the cable chamber floor was disguised with a removable metal plate, painted to match the chamber floor. From above, it looked like part of the normal infrastructure, but it could be removed from below to access the taps. By mid-August 1955, the tunnel was operational. Every phone call, every telegram, every communication on those cables was being intercepted, amplified, recorded, and analyzed. The operation was a technical marvel. The tunnel itself was an engineering achievement. The tap equipment was state-of-the-art. The recording systems were processing massive amounts of data, hundreds of simultaneous conversations, dozens of telegraph channels, all being captured 24/7. Teams of translators and analysts worked around the clock in the warehouse. Tape recorders ran continuously. The material was so voluminous that it was flown daily to CIA and SIS facilities in West Germany and Britain for detailed analysis. The intelligence gathered was extraordinary. Soviet military plans, unit deployments, capabilities assessments, communications between commanders, logistics information, everything. For 11 months, Operation Gold provided a window into Soviet military operations that intelligence agencies had never had before. And then on February 25th, 1956, Soviet engineers discovered the tunnel. Soviet press reported it as shocking proof of American espionage. They invited journalists to tour the tunnel. They displayed the sophisticated equipment. They expressed outrage at this violation of their sovereignty. The CIA and SIS were devastated. The tunnel had been discovered. Months of work, millions of dollars, and the intelligence source of the decade, all gone. Or so they thought. What nobody knew at the time was that the Soviets had known about the tunnel from the very beginning. The Soviet mole inside British intelligence, George Blake, had betrayed the operation in 1953, before construction even started. Blake was a British SIS officer assigned to the Berlin station. He attended the planning meetings for Operation Gold. He knew every detail, the location, the engineering plans, the intelligence targets, everything. And he reported all of it to his Soviet handlers. Soviets faced a dilemma. If they prevented the tunnel from being built, the West would know they had a source inside Western intelligence. The search for the mole would intensify. Blake would likely be discovered. But if they let the tunnel operate, they could manage the intelligence that flowed through it. They could feed disinformation through the tapped lines. They could gain insights into what the West was interested in, based on what they were trying to intercept. The Soviets chose to let it operate. They carefully managed what information was sent over the tapped lines. Genuine operational traffic was kept to a minimum. Routine communications were allowed. Occasional misleading information was fed through deliberately. The Soviets used the tunnel as a counterintelligence tool. For 11 months, they ran an elaborate deception operation, allowing the CIA and SIS to intercept carefully managed information while protecting their most sensitive communications. When they finally discovered the tunnel in February 1956, it was because the intelligence value of continuing the operation was outweighed by the propaganda value of exposing it. The public discovery of the tunnel was perfect propaganda. The Soviets could demonstrate Western espionage. They could show journalists the sophisticated equipment claiming it proved American aggressive intentions. They could position themselves as the victims of Western spying. And they could do all this while protecting George Blake, who remained undetected for another 5 years. The full truth didn't emerge until 1961, when Blake was finally exposed as a Soviet mole. Even then, it took years to piece together the full story. Blake had been present at the planning meetings. He'd known everything, and he'd told the Soviets everything. The CIA and SIS were shocked. The operation they'd thought was their greatest intelligence coup had been compromised from the start. The Soviets had known. They'd played along. They'd turned it into a counterintelligence operation. But here's the twist. Even though the Soviets knew about the tunnel, much of the intelligence gathered was still valuable. Why? Because the Soviets couldn't control everything that went through the tapped cables. The cables carried communications from hundreds of Soviet officers, officials, and units. The KGB couldn't tell everyone, be careful what you say on the phone because it's being tapped, without admitting they knew about the tap, which would have exposed Blake. So, routine communications continued. Officers gossiped. Units reported genuine logistics problems. Technical discussions about equipment happened naturally. All of this was captured and analyzed. Additionally, the Soviets couldn't perfectly control the information flow. They managed the high-level strategic communications, but lower-level tactical and logistical communications often contained genuine information simply because managing every single communication was impossible. Intelligence analysts later estimated that perhaps 70 to 80% of the information gathered was genuine, even if the most sensitive strategic communications were managed or false. So both sides could claim victory. The CIA and SIS had gathered massive amounts of valuable intelligence. The Soviets had protected their mole and run a successful counterintelligence operation. The Berlin tunnel operation had other lasting impacts. Technical innovation. The tunnel demonstrated that sophisticated underground operations were feasible. The technology developed for the tunnel, particularly the cable tapping equipment and the signal processing systems, advanced the state of the art in technical intelligence collection. Counterintelligence lessons. The Blake betrayal taught intelligence agencies hard lessons about internal security. The fact that one mole could compromise an operation involving hundreds of people showed the vulnerability of human intelligence operations. Cold War signaling. The tunnel, even after it was exposed, sent a message. The West had demonstrated capability and audacity. The Soviets had demonstrated their counterintelligence sophistication. Both sides gained respect for the other's capabilities. Propaganda value. For the Soviets, the exposed tunnel was perfect propaganda. They invited East German and international press to tour it. They published photographs and detailed descriptions. They used it to demonstrate Western espionage and justify their own security measures. For the West, even after the tunnel was exposed, it demonstrated technical prowess and bold intelligence operations. In the spy world, audacity has value even in failure. Berlin Wall. Justification. Some historians argue the tunnel, once exposed, contributed to the Soviets' decision to build the Berlin Wall in 1961. The tunnel showed how porous the Berlin border was and how the West could operate in the East. The wall was partly designed to prevent such operations in the future. The physical tunnel still exists, though it's no longer accessible. The East German government sealed it in 1956. Parts of it remain under what is now unified Berlin, a buried artifact of the Cold War. The warehouse that served as the entrance was demolished years ago. The site is now part of developed Berlin, with no visible trace of what happened there. George Blake, the Soviet mole who betrayed the operation, was arrested in 1961 and sentenced to 42 years in prison, an unprecedented sentence in Britain. He escaped from prison in 1966 and fled to Moscow, where he lived until his death in 2020 at age 98. He never expressed remorse for his betrayal. The intelligence gathered from the tunnel, over 50,000 reels of magnetic tape containing 443,000 intercepted conversations, was analyzed for years. Even knowing the operation had been compromised, analysts found the material valuable for understanding Soviet military organization, capabilities, and procedures. The Berlin Tunnel represented the Cold War at its most complex. It was simultaneously an engineering marvel, an intelligence coup, a counterintelligence operation, a propaganda tool, a demonstration of technical capability, a lesson in human vulnerability. Both sides claimed victory, and both had justification for the claim. The CIA and SIS gathered enormous amounts of intelligence, advanced their technical capabilities, and demonstrated boldness that earned respect even from their adversaries. The Soviets protected a valuable mole, ran a successful deception operation, gained propaganda value, and showed their own counterintelligence sophistication. In the strange logic of Cold War espionage, everyone won, and everyone lost. And the tunnel under Berlin stood as a monument to the complexity of intelligence warfare. The operation also stood as a testament to what could be achieved through audacity and technical excellence. Building a 476-foot tunnel under a hostile border, operating sophisticated surveillance equipment in secret, and managing an operation involving hundreds of people while maintaining security, these were extraordinary achievements, regardless of the Blake betrayal. The engineers and intelligence officers who built and operated the tunnel never knew it had been compromised. They believed they were conducting the intelligence operation of the century. And in a way, they were just not in the way they thought. The Berlin Tunnel remains one of the most famous intelligence operations in history. It's studied in intelligence courses. It's featured in spy museums. It's written about in countless books and articles. It represents the Cold War's strange reality. Massive efforts, enormous resources, sophisticated operations, all playing out in a shadow war where both sides were often running operations against each other simultaneously, sometimes without realizing it. The tunnel that shocked the Soviets, who already knew about it. The intelligence coup that was compromised from the start, but still produced valuable intelligence. The operation where everyone won and everyone lost. That was the Berlin Tunnel, the most audacious intelligence operation of the Cold War, and the most complicated success in espionage history.